with Lise and Julia Ramírez-Blanco and Adam Stock, who can't be here today, we've been thinking a lot for the last couple of years about the meaning and value of this term ecotopia and what kinds of cultural, analytical and social work it might make possible in the context of the Capitalocene or Anthropocene. In particular, I suppose we are interested in exploring the value of explicitly adopting a utopian perspective in the face of the new climate regime and in the face of ecosocial crisis, taking a perhaps strategically naive position to insist on the necessity and possibility of imagining otherwise, to perhaps take the hints that I think we've already heard in some of the papers during the sessions today and yesterday, to imagine and practice and represent alternative values, ways of seeing and knowing, and put them at the forefront of our attention. So I don't work on visual culture. I'm a sociologist. I work primarily with speculative fiction, which is in itself quite unusual. And I'll leave it to Lise to focus on the visual in our presentation today. So my job, I think, is to fill in some ideas and thinking about this concept of ecotopia within the context of utopian studies and utopianism, this project that we're trying to build. So this word ecotopia was originally coined in a 1975 novel by Ernst Callenbach. This is not a recommendation, it's a terrible novel. But this word has come to kind of circulate, I think, more generally to refer to ideas about better ways for organizing social life, to value equality, sustainability, solidarity, justice and care in more than human worlds, standing for attempts to express and explore visions of the good life that reject systemic unsustainability, the historical separation of nature and humans in Western thought, and the global system of extractive capitalism rooted in colonialism. So we're wondering about the capacity of this term ecotopia to connect across academic disciplines, maybe even connect with public and policy debates, to foreground the need to imagine and practice better, greener futures. Typically, ecotopia is used to refer to political visions that are opposed to expansive and extractive capitalism, experiments in alternative sustainable lifestyles, so what in utopian studies we call intentional communities, and often to green utopian narrative fictions, particularly science fiction novels. But I think we can also think of ecotopia as a hermeneutic or a lens to identify and analyze a much wider range of cultural forms, everyday practices, affects, alternative knowledges that express or embody some desire for a better way of living and being. So current public and policy debates on the challenge of climate change and eco-social breakdown, as you'll be aware, often focus on piecemeal reform, on technological quick fixes, or building so-called resilience, often through the reproduction of existing social structures. Ecotopian approaches would focus on the imagination of alternatives, centering visionary approaches to structural transformation and cultural reinvention. And I think what we're trying to do with this work on ecotopia is to try and clarify the value of explicitly thinking about ecotopia in academic and perhaps public contexts, to try and research key social and cultural sites where utopian imaginaries and practices are produced and generated, and amplify this understanding and use of ecotopia as a political and cultural force in the Capitalocene. So you can think about ecotopia then in these sorts of ways. I've already talked this through. And we draw here on a rich tradition, a multidisciplinary tradition of utopian studies to kind of enrich our thought. In utopian studies, there's been a huge amount of thinking about the concept of utopia, attempts to link it to different traditions of critical and radical social and political theory, so most notably in its early iterations, Marxism, anarchism, feminism, I think. Latterly, post-human, queer and Afrofuturist theorizing are really playing a lively role, I think, in redefining utopian studies. And it's a field that helps to identify examples of utopian imagination and practice at work in different historical periods and across different socio-political and cultural contexts. Two key figures in this network of thought are the Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch and the sociologist and one of my mentors, Ruth Levitas. Both have contributed a lot to the rejection of common sense, modernist ideas of utopia as a rigid, detailed blueprint of a better society. And Bloch's work has been particularly important here as redefining utopia as a kind of process, consisting in gestures towards rather than exhaustive descriptions of alternative ways of living and organizing collective life. So for Bloch, utopia is the name for various modes of anticipatory consciousness and the open-endedness of material change in the worlds that we live in. And these, for Bloch, are essential aspects of human social experience. So utopia is not this esoteric or obscure form, limited to literature or architectural blueprints. It has been richly concentrated in some of those areas, but for Bloch, utopia is a hugely ubiquitous and ordinary way of thinking and dreaming, present across cultures and woven into individual psyches. And I use that short quote there from Lefebvre, which I think sums up some of those ways in which we can all, in small ways, fragmented ways, fleeting ways. I don't want to overclaim about these small ways in which we can all be utopian, but we can all be. So Ruth Levitas's work defines utopia broadly as the expression of the desire for a better way of living and being, arguing that such expressions are always necessary, if not strictly essential, outcomes of the experience of living in social conditions that don't enable us and our non-human context increasingly and companions increasingly to flourish. So utopia is not so much the object or the goal, but the dreaming and the desire, the capacity to imagine and want something different. Levitas's work has also been really important in centering functional definitions of utopia, asking not so much what is utopia as a kind of static or formalizable thing, but asking what utopia or utopianism can do. And that notion of utopianism is an interesting one. We can talk about that maybe more in another context. It's more to do with how utopian expressions can work to confront or undo the idea that existing social arrangements must be this way. The utopian then makes space for critique of the status quo, driven by the desire for something better, to reveal problematic ideas of the good life at work in hegemonic narratives. And a more recent work in Utopia as Method, Levitas argues that there are three basic modes of the utopian: archaeological, existential, and architectural. I'm not sure she necessarily chose the right labels for these modes of thinking, but she's trying to talk here about the capacity of an explicit lens of the utopian to dig up visions of the good life that justify and mobilize like actions in the present that are problematic, so that we can actually talk about them and identify them. We might talk in that context about recognizing with someone like Laurent Ballant the cruel optimism of the kind of late stage welfare capitalism that we find ourselves in, which keeps us committed to promises of a good life that we know these systems can no longer realize, right? The existential mode of utopianism is what I've already talked about, this kind of capacity for everyone to have a kind of utopian imaginary. And the architectural mode is where the utopian becomes much more elaborate, to kind of express and communicate a very specific set of values and desires. So in my own work, I focus on narrative speculative fiction as a particularly, for me, intriguing mode of imagining society otherwise and enabling a creative, imagined construction and a way of trying to feel out. So it's quite affective for me, what fiction can do, a sense of what it might be like to experience and live within an alternative set of social arrangements. And in science fiction criticism, certainly of literary science fiction, much has been made of the capacity of utopian fiction to produce the effect of what Dacre-Sevin calls cognitive estrangement, whereby immersion in narrative descriptions of alternative worlds generates an epistemological realization that things might be different. And in that space, there's also opportunities for creative speculation about what we might want, not just what we might expect. So our project takes seriously the idea that I'll skip that one. Our project takes seriously the idea that a processual, desiring, and open-ended form of utopianism is ubiquitous in everyday life in various cultures and practices. And as the climate and linked eco-social crises press harder on everyday experience, we can see those traces of ecotopianism at work. But while I think contemporary utopian scholarship has offered really excellent analyses of many utopian proposals, communities, fictions, artworks, there are very few investigations actually of how specific ecotopian expressions are made, how they circulate, how they affect those who encounter them, how utopian ideas might travel, how they might inspire, how they might change people and collectives, and how those collectives might in turn reshape and reinvigorate the ecotopian imagination. So by bringing a kind of interdisciplinary approach to this across arts and qualitative social sciences, looking not just at cultural texts, but also at how they resonate, how people might work with them, what difference they can make, we think we can devise a project that might really help us to understand better, not just what ecotopia is, but what it might do, how it might generate new kind of modes of thinking. So in my research with my colleague, Miranda Iosifidis, we've been working with readers of speculative ecofiction to try and explore how individually and in collectives, in dialogues, they make epistemological and affective sense of new, speculative, and in particular weird modes of environmental narratives. We've looked with readers at the Southern Reach trilogy, at the work of N.K. Jemisin, at Octavia Butler's work. And we want to bring these kinds of granular, co-created arts and creative methods in the social sciences more broadly to understand engagement with and the prospects for ecotopian narrative and imaginaries more broadly. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to do, clarify and deepen a kind of heuristic for identifying green utopianism at work in the world, identifying examples of ecotopian knowledges, visions, and practices, and develop methods to gain a fuller understanding of how those kinds of ideas, images, stories, and practices emerge, but also how they affect and people, publics, as they circulate and are encountered. And on that, I'm going to hand over to Lise. We need to move, don't we? Okay.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. So, thank you very much, Lisa, for this fantastic introduction, which is like much more than just an introduction. She is the specialist on ecotopias on this project. So yeah, I feel quite humble, especially because I will speak in English in front of mostly people speaking French, so which is quite unusual for me. But yeah, let's go. As part of the ECOImagine project, there are many artistic examples evocative of ecotopias. Their origins diverge and the imaginations and sensibilities represented fluctuate, allowing us to envision the variety of possibilities expressed through artistic prisms. The latter are often rooted in emancipatory narratives derived from the past struggles and desires for future revolutions, and also mainly from literature, particularly science fiction. It seems essential that the meetings, exchanges, and interviews during the ECOImagine project concretely should benefit from the artistic perspectives at the very heart of the research project. The idea will be to combine practical workshop sessions, for example, self-editing, prefigurative writing, fanzines, etc., with above all the support of a duo of artists, L'Atelier Maclean. And I was keen to present some of the angles of analysis that bring together many of the artists whose work will be analyzed and associated in this project based on the work of Atelier Maclean, which is a duo of artists and activists based in Brittany, France. Their work has long been rooted in deeply anti-capitalistic, anti-fascist, anti-specist and feminist experiences of everyday life in response to the ecosocial crisis. Three main issues can be read today in their work and unfolded as tools, or something that I considered could be tools for analyzing other artistic works. So for Atelier Maclean, as for other artists, it is pointless to mobilize thoughts about utopias that are detached from any radicality. Ecotopian issues must be revolutionary and politically anchored if we are to avoid undermining the power of radical utopias, as Alice Karabedian clearly states in a recent essay, defending the idea of desirable possibles against that of adequate alternatives. So in her recent essay, Utopie radicale, par-delà l'imaginaire des cabanes et des ruines, et j'adore ce titre, donc je le prononce en entier, she takes a critical look at the uses made of utopian imaginaries by left-wing movements, activists, and artists. She argues that these imaginary worlds very often merge alternatives and utopian narrative, proposing, I quote, solutions to possibilities that have already been realized, derived from the good ideas of alternative, ecological, outer globalization, countercultural, and socialist circles, end of quote. The basic problem is that the vast majority of these elements are based in reality. As she writes, and I quote again, the imaginary should not only serve to replay what has already been played out. It should be used to open doors, end of quote. For the MacLean duo, these imperfect utopias that they talked about in the slides just before are seen as necessities and cannot simply be the result of a pleasant exercise in anticipation. They are certainly part of a line of past activist actions and take up its codes, but ecotopias must be nourished by radical prefigurative perspectives. So in Utopia, this screen print here that you see, we can easily read the signs of the founding gestures of utopia that is desirable in their sense. So a good life in harmony with the non-human or more than human, radical political activisms, free management of time and emancipation through self-education and or reading, and virtuous peasantry. Their vision of imperfect utopias is in many ways akin to that of L'Expérience, an anarchist communist colony founded in 1906 in Stokkelbois, near Brussels, Belgium, whose daily life is accessible to us via a series of postcards, self-published newspapers, and textual resources. We see the colonists in a mise en scène of themselves, as the group was adept at what we call la propagande par l'exemple, propaganda by example. The hiatus lies in the fact that the MacLeans allow themselves the communal luxury of leaving open the boundaries of application of their artistic proposals, images, and narrative fictions, and not only promoting their practical applications. So careful observation of the non-human and herbarium then become decisive tools for thinking about collective modes of organization, whether through mycelium or brambles as metaphor. As avid readers of science fiction and critical theory, Julia Crinon and Hugo Marchal, to name them, explore and explain how botanical models of organization are powerful tools for imagining ecotopias. The patterns in which plants spread and circulate through marcoting, le marcotage, enable to think about the effects of vegetative multiplication underground, as well as asexual modes of reproductions. The purpose is to be nourished on the wisdom of Lianae, la sagesse des lianes, and weave refuges from, I quote the MacLeans, barricades of bark and skin, hairy stems, and slimy caps. And to go on with another quote, this time from Denetem Twambona in Sagesse des Lianes, where back and front, fiction and reality, cause and effect intertwine and condition each other in a twisting movement of space-time with the aim of making desirable futures accessible to the imaginary. Hence, the Brambles speak of the need to embrace a radical transformation of identities as fixed by a patriarchal, capitalist, and racist system. Thinking about ecotopias is a way of calling for rights to opacity. And I go a bit quick, I'm sorry, but yeah. In the representation forged by the MacLeans, identities are uncertain, ambiguous, and always queer. Bodies are genderless or adopt fluid gender identities, often associating botanical elements with apparent limbs, for example, mushroom caps or mushroom heads, or roots or bramble boots, as you can see here. The bodies are mostly depicted in groups, crowds, or masses. Faces and singularities are masked in favor of agentivities and capacities for action. In short, it's a question of deprivatizing the proper name through the borrowed name and undoing the individualist fiction of the face through the balaclava, to quote Paul Preciado, on an appointment on Uranus. Okay, references to the past in the manner of a spark. The Macleans see references to the past as fertile gleanings to nourish radical imaginaries. Inspired by struggles, the motif of their work are also reappropriations of popular imaginaries monopolized by oppressive systems. Michel Rio-Sarcé and Claudia Moatti highlight the benefits of reference and the emergence of the past, or rather the way in which reference arises in the present of the event through, I quote, the spark of unfinished, forgotten experiences. From a slightly different perspective, we find here the way in which Frederick James Sparks that emerge from the comets carried by utopian visions in archaeologies of the future as he writes change in our social existence, which has not first thrown off utopian visions like so many sparks from a comet. Ecological and ecotopic perspectives are fundamental to the work of contemporary artists for long and have been so in a specific way. References to the past now often involve the identification historically situated and the construction of narrative identified by aspects are both documentary and fictional, but also and above all by the practices, rituals, affects, and corporealities that might be associated with, but rather on its developments, its deployments, and its effects. One of the singularities of these more recent references in contemporary art is that they interweave these sparks to construct new modes of representation and evocation. In a way, the artists identify these sparks in order to produce new ones in a kind of mise en abîme that unfolds the possibilities. Sparks of sparks, anchored in those, quote, unfinished, forgotten experiences that took as in the work of Atelier Maclean and the collective Nocturne, Diurne, Queer Violence that contributed to the publication that I show you here, tore fragments of the past with these sorry, I will do it again. That's the end. So the collective NDQ restore fragments of the past where these strategic nodes appear, to quote Michel Rio-Sarcé in her fantastic book, Le réel de l'utopie. Thank you very much.